So without further ado, I think we should go ahead and let you start.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And let me get myself together. And thank you all for coming out and inviting me. And it's great to be a part of this conversation, hopefully a collective conversation. And I'm going to try to stay to as many panels as possible during the heat of great. And it's also especially rewarding to be here given the interdisciplinary and I think the liberatory thrust of this PVI collective, especially given the fact that this is in many ways, I think, a landmark year for a transformative interdisciplinary study at the University of Virginia. More than 1,000, or I should say more than 50 years ago, a group of students, though they look like 1,000 years ago, more than 50 years ago, a group of students at the University of Virginia marched on the rotunda to register their discontent and their outrage at the persistence of white supremacy and economic injustice at the University of Virginia. This was on February the 18th, 1969, and it was entitled A March Against UVA's Racist Atmosphere. And at that march, more than 1,000 students showed up. And of course, at this time, the university was only about 1.9% African American. So you can imagine that the vast majority of those students were white. And in that march, they made several demands. One, that the president rid the university of all vestiges of Jim Crow segregation, demanded that the president hire a black dean of admissions, assistant dean of admissions, demanded that the president integrate the athletic department. The University of Virginia was the last school in the ACC to integrate. And in 1970, they integrated with 4 African Americans, Kent Merritt, John Rainey, Stanley Land, and a black quarterback by the name of Harrison Davis. They also demanded that workers be granted a living wage. And they also demanded that the university recognize the right of workers to unionize. And last but certainly not least for me, I would not be here today if they did not make the demand that the university, by the fall of 1970, have a African American Studies, Black Studies program. And that was implemented in 1970. 1 month after this historic march, the Black Students for Freedom, which is the precursor to the Black Student Alliance, issued a 17-page proposal outlining their vision for African American studies and the importance of African American studies on this campus. And they said, at present, most students here are culturally deprived, insofar as they are confined to a white upper middle class ghetto. Needless to say, if we are going to receive an adequate education for our contemporary world, such circumstances must change. In many ways, they echoed a remark made by Armstead Robinson at Yale's 1968 Conference for Black Studies. He said, educational institutions in this society have necessary and inherent political and social obligations. If your function of equipping students to cope successfully with reality is to be fulfilled, then you must not only be responsible in terms of your educational functions, you must also be responsive to the communities you supposedly serve. Armstead Robinson. So I thank you for inviting me, because in many ways I feel like being a part of this collective conversation is a way to honor those 1,000 students in 1969 who made these demands. And interestingly enough, the university did really nothing to sort of commemorate the 50th anniversary of this important day. So whether it be the religious studies symposium on James Cone or this, I'm using these moments as an opportunity to do our own sort of individual and collective commemoration. So in many ways, I see this initiative, as well as the work of other units, as continuing that legacy. And of course, that legacy would also continue in 1970. When we think about violence, this is a picture from the lawn, May of 1970, after the murder of 4 co-eds at Kent State University. Across the country, students engaged in protests against escalating levels of militarization in our country, and of course, Richard Nixon's decision to invade Cambodia. And across the country, students engaged in protests. 4 students at Kent State, of course, were murdered on the afternoon of May the 4th. By 6 p.m., news of that murder has spread across the country, and at 10 p.m., about 1,500 students gathered at the rotunda to register once again their discontent and their protest. And at this protest, they begin to talk about the demands, and they begin to talk about linking their critique of militarization with racism, but also with their critique of the continued exploitation of labor on campus. So once again, in May of 1970, they issue similar demands. And I'm going to show some of the pictures because it helps us also think about issues of power, violence, and inequality. More than 144 students were arrested during this period. But unlike the university or Virginia Tech University, they were not expelled. So once again, I see the work that PVI is doing as part of this legacy. And in many ways, I see our collective endeavors over the past 2 years as evidence of our ability to respond to the challenges of the university, higher education in Charlottesville. What I wanted to do today was talk a little bit about Charlottesville and talk a little bit about some of the initiatives that I've been a part of over the last year and a half, and particularly talk about the publication of Charlottesville 2017. And while I am here, I'm representing that collective, and I want to actually bring up some of the arguments put forth in that book. So in the immediate aftermath of the white supremacist rallies of August 11th and 12th, many of us affiliated with the university found ourselves responding to a variety of demands and initiatives, I think specific to the Summer of Hate, but also connected to a long legacy of racial injustice, violence. I mean, how can we forget the picture of Martise Johnson, for example, when then third-year students beaten brutally on the corner by ABC officials. So we wanted to, we were responding to a variety of demands and initiatives specific to the Summer of Hate, but also connected to a longer legacy of racial injustice, violence, and deep, deep, deep economic inequality in this community and beyond. 2 months after the Unite the Right rallies, I agreed to co-edit with Lewis Nelson, Charlottesville 2017, a collection of essays written by UVA faculty. And it was an intellectual decision, but it was one with that also carried a certain ethical burden. I was not always sure what it meant to sort of write in the process of pain and trauma and healing, and also I did not want this volume to be used by the university to sort of parade itself as responding to this issue. And so I think sometimes when we're within the academy, we have to think about the ethical politics of our decisions, because sometimes in even confronting white supremacy, we do a certain kind of symbolic work, but yet there's not real substantive change. Charlottesville 2017 was really organized around 3 broad themes. We wanted to reflect, we wanted to remember, and we wanted to respond. In many ways, the book emerged out of our desire to use our particular skills and our perspectives, I think, to facilitate a deeper understanding of the events of August 11th and 12th and to situate them in a broader historical and political context, and to offer suggestions for creating a more just world. And I think also we had to confront the epistemic challenge of violence. And what I mean by the epistemic challenge of violence is, if there had not been a murder, one doubts that there would be a volume. And at the same time, we had to move beyond the tendency to present this act of violence and the death of Heather Heyer, though we know that there were other people who were injured and still faced certain difficulties, how to present this act or move beyond the presentation of this act as exceptional or episodic, and at the same time maintain a sense of her humanity and maintain a sense of the reality that a mother lost their child, that somebody left their house that morning and didn't come back.
And in some ways, that's the epistemic of violence. And trying to write a book that talked about the varieties of violence inflicted upon humanity, the living and the non-living. To borrow from contributor Lisa Woolfolk, we also wanted to raise the question, were the white supremacist rallies of August 11th and 12th an invasion or a homecoming? And how were they connected to the long legacy of anti-Black racism and white supremacist violence? Not just white supremacist violence, broadly speaking, but the white supremacist violence that is rooted in the very soil at this university. In her essay, she wrote, "Heinous violations of the enslaved are recorded in the archives of the Jewel database, including the first documented rape case that resulted in student expulsion. Though students were punished in this case, there is substantial evidence to support the notion that extreme acts of violence against the enslaved could be accepted as part of the institutional culture of the university. For instance, in 1856, a student who beat a 10-year-old slave girl until she lost consciousness defended himself and successfully appealed his punishment by claiming, quote, 'Whenever a servant is insolent, I will take upon myself the right of punishing him without the consent of his master,' end quote." She continues, "This enslaved child was not this student's property, yet as a slave, she was subject to his whims and authority. He was exonerated." So once again, one of our challenges in writing this book is thinking about what happened in the summer of 2017, but connecting it to a larger legacy of racialized violence. Another question that we had as it relates to violence is, have we sacrificed, and I think in light of what's going on in Charlotte, we have to think about this. Have we sacrificed too much at the altar of the First Amendment? Have we sacrificed too much at the altar of the First Amendment? We had several essays by Woolfolk, by Leslie Kendrick, by Risa Goluboff, who raised important questions about the First and Second Amendment and the need for us to be vigilant about the ways in which free speech has been weaponized in this country. And so I think interdisciplinary collectives like this are important because I think we have to think about violence and we have to think about the ways in which it is supported by the law. I tell my students all the time when we talk about Trayvon Martin, one of the hardest things to confront is if you read Florida's Stand Your Ground law, George Zimmerman was in his rights. So we have to think about the violence that is supported by the law. Now, of course, we know if there were a group of Black Panthers asking for a permit, to walk around with torches, come on. But anyway, as Nicole Hemmer makes clear, the alt-right has figured out how to turn free speech, a cornerstone of liberal democracy, into a tool for dismantling that democracy. It is able to do so because most Americans, even highly educated ones, have a fuzzy understanding of both free speech and democratic institutions and values. Clarity cannot come quickly enough to institutions of higher education and the boards and politicians who govern them. The First Amendment gives Richard Spencer the right to shout on street corners. It does not give him the right to set up shop in the student union and recruit disaffected white men to his cause. Until universities grasp this and create a set of guidelines to govern their relationship to extremist anti-liberal ideologies, they will continue to be the site where men like William Fears are radicalized, end quote. And at the same time, if we do not deal with the history of white supremacy at this university and at beyond, and the ways in which these folks are considered part of family, the ways in which their language is not considered a weapon, we're doomed. As Risa Goluboff points out, quote, "So much of what occurred in Charlottesville was not constitutionally protected expression at all. It was physical violence in the form of assault, battery, and even homicide. The fact that white supremacists presented themselves as free speakers, wanted to be thought of as free speakers, and indeed engaged in some protected speech did not immunize the violence and intimidation in which they organized. But let's go back to Teresa Sullivan's email. Prior to August 11th. We also support the First Amendment rights to free speech and assembly. These rights belong to the Unite the Right activists who will express their beliefs and to the many others who disagree with them. Lisa Woolfolk responds, in my head. This perception of white supremacy as a First Amendment issue supports the ways in which the Tort Lynch rally itself might have been seen as neither disorderly nor dangerous. Why 300 men carrying lit torches were not seen as an actionable menace is something we have to think about. She argues this inaction is a consequence of viewing white supremacy as only an idea rather than a social practice rooted in violence. A social practice rooted in violence. So we were attempting to understand this. We were also attempting to understand, and I'll speed up, how do we move beyond symbolic politics and produce substantive change that deals with the problems of poverty and unemployment, affordable housing, and universities growing functions as a quasi-government that profoundly influence urban planning and development, policing practices, and wage scales in ways detrimental to people of color and the working class? This is a question. In order to get at that, I think we also have to begin to think through how we teach violence. There is a way in which violence serves a certain kind of, it provides a certain kind of ideological work in the classroom. So I noticed that when I talk about violence and when I show the pictures of the crazy white supremacists, there is a way in which my students can interpret that as exceptional. And housing issues, living wage issues, that's something else. And so one of my strategies has also been as a teacher, and I talked to a group of students about this Saturday, is I'm moving away from the word white supremacist at moments, and I also say I like the Unite the Right rallies, because it enables me to connect this terror to the terror of voter suppression, to the terror of voter ID laws, to the systematic ways in which the GOP is attempting to undermine the Black electorate. From 2011 to 2016, more than 2 million votes were purged in Ohio. When you begin to think about that, and when you begin to think about this, perhaps we can think about this moment as a post-Reconstruction moment, as an 1877 moment, as an 1880 moment, as an 1885 moment. To move forward, we have to begin to reckon with our past. We also have to begin to reckon with the ways in which violence is sort of embedded in culture. And so one of the last essays that I just want to talk about or just mention and quote is from Bonnie Gordon, brilliant professor in the music department, who tells us that we need to listen to these moments of violence. In the second decade of the 21st century, this is Bonnie Gordon, white supremacists are staging a culture war that transports toxic, violent imaginings of Western culture and an apocalyptic nationalism, especially opera, to the former slaveholding South. Beneath the Confederate flags, Nazi symbols, and loud cries of white nationalism that filled the summer of hate were familiar refrains, rhythms, and narrative arcs. The events of August 11th and 12th were part of a year of spectacles designed to draw out and play on institutional legacies of white supremacy, and especially its 20th century renditions, making use of burning torches, the singing of Dixie, and Nazi slogans. But the university tells us we just need to have a class that deals with diversity and race. You just need to incorporate diversity and race into, orientation. And the university also tells us, and the college tells us, that also the liberal arts will save us. Well, Bonnie says maybe not. Quote, Richard Spencer is a harsh reminder that a liberal arts education does not necessarily defend against white supremacy. Of course, he was a double major in music and English. Nor do efforts by the University of Virginia and other universities to memorialize enslaved workers. And the events he catalyzed bring to the fore the fact that it is not enough to get college students to see the grotesque potential of some of the music they love, especially if it includes sounds mobilized by the likes of Hitler. Most undergraduates who take music classes learn about sonic performances of nationalism. It's a box or chapter in many textbooks. But these days, it might even be more important to make sure they can hear the ways that racialized nationalism plays out, politically and musically, in their own contemporary spaces. So in many ways, the book, Charlottesville 2017, is contemplative. And because we had to put it together in a year in order to make the anniversary, it's improvisational as well. And like the best jazz tune, it is open-ended. It invites critique. It is scholarly, but it is also a song cry. It asks and answers tough questions, but it also admits the need to dig deeper. It's a call to action, but it also demands critical and I think ethical reflection. So, thank you. Great.
I know we're running a bit late, but I'm guessing there might be others too.
Yeah, like
I hate to let you just
Yeah.
You bring so many interesting ideas. Maybe we could just add them?
yeah, I think so,
Okay.
yeah.
I just didn't want to do that on my own.
Sorry I went over.
Please. She's first by the fourth.
Yes.
So at another institution, there was an issue with white male supremacists coming onto campus and engaging not only in hate speech but sometimes physical altercations with students. And that administration, so you touched upon what's the difference between protected free speech and hate speech that incites harm. And so that university was so scared of being sued by the white supremacist violent people who come to campus that they said this is a First Amendment issue, we can't infringe on it. At the same time that they were infringing on the students' First Amendment rights and not letting them speak on campus anywhere, but they created these zones out of the public eye where students were allowed to have rallies or what have you. And it just, it seemed like such a profound failing for the students' safety and well-being. I can remember one day students walking into my class like visibly shaken after they'd just been verbally assaulted, on their way to class, and thinking, how can the university fail to provide, doesn't it have a responsibility to provide, and to attempt to provide a reasonable amount of safety but it just kept falling back to that we don't want to get sued over this First Amendment issue. So, and then thinking about, how can we reframe our thinking? If we look at the way that we use language and the way that media sort of, if you look at all the white males doing mass killings or killing, former intimate partners or killing their children, if we look at the numbers that just occur on any day of the week, but the way that the media goes out of its way to sympathize with them and to legitimize and place them as valuable members, well, it does the othering that's the language that gets used and how these acts of violence and the people who do them get normalized. And what can we do to start flipping that so that we're more aligned with reality instead of re-perpetuating, this white supremacy that is so prevalent. How can, like here in Charlottesville, what are steps that we could take, daily to try to turn this around, either here within UVA or Charlottesville?
Well, I think on a broader level, we have to begin to deal with the myth of exceptionalism and American exceptionalism, and begin to deal with the myth of masculinity, begin to deal with the myth of white supremacy, begin to redefine what it means to be man, what it means to be one. I mean, we have to redefine everything, and that's the kind of long-term work that we have to engage in. Some of us will probably never see the results of. So there has to be a rethinking of everything that we imagine, and we have to understand that the media also functions to serve the dominant order. So there's definitely when there's something that is done, there's a rush to sort of normalize it, because to confront and to say this is not actually exceptional, but this is part of the violent fabric of this nation, that's a hard pill to swallow. In terms of immediate, one is declaring certain areas of residential areas. I mean, people live on the lawn. So people live on the lawn. One, enforcing the laws that were already in existence. Tiki torches, no. But the second thing is, and Risa Goluboff brings this up, the protection of somebody's First Amendment rights is actually an infringement upon someone else's civil rights. So one of the things she talks about is the ways in which we need to think about this conflict that's happening between the First Amendment and the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlines certain things and certain protections that people are supposed to have in a public space. So also, I think there are some legal questions. There's also some legal questions in terms of when you think about the relationship between the First Amendment and the Second Amendment and the blending of these two amendments as people are coming on grounds with guns. And the same kind of assertiveness that people displayed with the bicentennial celebration. We had students that were arrested for a sign. I think we can look at the ways in which certain protections are put forth in moments where there's a big celebration, that we need to think about what happened in that moment. Yes?
I wanted to ask you, you mentioned in the beginning that one of the goals of the book was to reflect, remember, and respond. And I'm interested in the idea of memory, and how you think about the kind of restorative properties of memory and their role in kind of moving forward.
Explain more. Restorative.
So it seems to me that memory or remembering is a crucial part of moving forward and responding. So I guess I'm trying to understand how you think about that,
right,
and how it becomes, what is it about that process that makes it possible, that opens possibility again?
That's great. I think how we were thinking about memory, we were thinking about remembering the past, remembering and reconstructing the Confederate monuments, the history behind those monuments, the communities that were displaced before those monuments were constructed in the early 20th century, comparing our attempt to remember and reconstruct with the ways in which the lost cause is remembered and constructed and used in this current moment. And it is undergirded, I think, at times, whether it be John Mason talking about the Blue Ribbon Commission, and in his reflection, he talks about having or grappling with momentarily a sense of guilt. That what if we didn't push on this question of the Confederate monuments? Would this have not have happened? So the politics of remembering and reconstructing, the challenges of remembering and reconstructing, but it's also premised on this idea that if people just know the truth, if people know that Robert E. Lee was not the great accommodator, if people just knew that there was actually a black neighborhood in that area where those monuments stand, and that neighborhood had been, raised. And if people just knew that, if people just knew that there was a rebirth or reinterest in these Confederate symbols during the Civil Rights Movement, that they would understand that what's happening now is not about remembering one's Southern heritage, but it's about maintaining white supremacy. And I think at the same time, we are naive when we think that that will fundamentally change things, because we don't seem to understand the ways in which narratives about the past are weaponized and used to advance those kind of politics. So I think in terms of memory, remembering, for me, it was important for me to talk about white supremacy, but in my essay it was also important for me to remember the tradition and the legacy of student activism. That became important to me when a black student came up to me the first forum we had after the first week in class, and she says, the first week of class, and so we had a big forum in Now Hall, and she says, Professor Harrell, I'm scared. The white supremacists have promised to return, and I don't feel like the university has an adequate response. She said, I have one question for you. How do you maintain faith? And at the heart of that, she's dealing with the question of theodicy. How do you believe in some faith or even some higher being with the existence of evil? And for me, history provides that, remembering the legacy of protest, remembering those who came before me, enables me to move in a particular kind of way. So for me, and that may not be the best answer, but so memory, how remembering even that legacy of protest. Because I think sometimes we can get so bound by talking about white supremacy and trying to prove to people who you can't prove that white supremacy exists, that we also ignore these traditions of protest and these traditions of activism, and how we can learn from them, learn the lessons, learn the triumphs, learn the failures, and begin to move forward. So for me, that's how I was thinking through the politics of memory. But the other side of memory is forgetting, right? And understanding that, they work in tandem with each other. And I know we gotta go, but I will say this within the context of this moment where we all have initiatives and we all are doing things, whether it be film or whether it be books, we also face the danger of being so beholden to our projects and our narratives that we forget the beauty of improvisation. And we forget the beauty of sometimes saying, okay, I thought it was this, but it's really that. So in some ways, as much as putting together a volume can be a pain, I look forward to actually 5 years from now or 10 years from now when I think we also have moments to critically reflect. Because the reality is that those who were most affected in a kind of physical way, violent way, some people are still recovering. And so there's also a way in which these voices that you hear in the immediate aftermath don't always include the folks who were most affected. Not all of them, but So I think the politics of memory and public history is interesting in this moment.
Last question, comment. First of all, I appreciate your comments.
Thank you.
And it really kind of forced me to kind of think about an article, and I just want to get your reaction to it. It's an article by Ian Ward that kind of talks about democratic civility and the dangers of niceness and how that kind of plays out, because when we think about democratic civility, it oscillates, right? Mm-hmm. As an academic, as a teacher, as a community member, what are your thoughts regarding that, this whole notion of dangers of niceness, being too nice when we think about civility?
Yeah, it's very dangerous, and I teach a course, Black Fire, and right after Charlottesville 2017, the history department said, okay, we're gonna make sure you get many TAs as possible so I had 256 students in the class. Still only 3 graders. That's a whole nother story. And I have my black students say my classes have been gentrified. And so I remember in 2013, I taught a class called The Sounds of Blackness, and it had 146 students, and 143 were black. That doesn't happen anymore. And I have a lot of white students who take my class, and they are across frat guy, progressives, frats, all of them. I notice if I'm showing that picture, they're fine. When I start talking about housing, when I start talking about living wage, when I start talking about the First Amendment and Second Amendment, when I push them out of their comfort zone, because they can say, I'm not that. Mm-hmm. But they can't necessarily say, I need to rethink public school system. And so I notice that we can have civility when they are comfortable. And sometimes I like civility. Nobody naturally, very few people like conflict. I don't want to deal with certain things. But to me, if I left this class this year and all they were thinking about is that, I failed them. I failed the people that I talked about in 69. And so while I may make them comfortable, those black students that are in my class and those white progressives and Latinx they're looking at me like, okay, Professor Harold, what you gonna do? Because we depended on you. You're gonna just make this easy for them. So I must admit, I had a moment. They do student interviews. They do interviews in Black Fire. And they tend to interview, like the baseball team, and I've had years where it's the entire baseball team in the class. They interview the baseball coach. I let them do that because that's their comfort zone. Well, this year, a group of students interviewed a certain football coach, and he talked about race, and he talked about how, when he was here, he didn't get into that blackness stuff and all that stuff. I let my race and my pride show on the football field. And I'm a former athlete. And they were giving me this whole narrative of how sports brings us together. And I said, look, and I just lost it. I said, you know what? My team, sometimes the black players didn't like the white players. And sometimes we didn't like how the white coach talked to the black players and said, you don't try hard enough, and how the white players were always crafty and, they work hard. And that who works harder than LeBron James? You can't be that good and not work hard. But that is never put on black. So this went on for like 20 minutes. And the students was like, but I had lost because I knew that narrative. And what I told them? I said, I don't want us to come together. I want you to fight white supremacy. Coming together does nothing. And sometimes, so I push them and I say, you know what? I may lose 5, but that's not good enough. That's not good enough when you think about the severity of the urgency of the moment. So that's how I feel. So they may feel like I was not civil, but they had to be pushed in a particular kind of way. Coming together is not enough. And then when you push them, they say, I never thought about that, because we're working with these narratives and this language that exists. And so we just, because they just trying to talk and make up this 5 minutes that they got to make this presentation. So they just, we need to come together in unity. And I told them, I say, McDonald's brings a lot of people together all the time. The Roots, that salad place, it brings folks in, more than anything on campus. But, so just pushing them. And it's not comfortable sometimes. Because like I said, I don't always want conflict. I really don't. I want to feel like, yeah, my students got it. They're thinking about political economy, but when you got to push them. And so that's how I feel about civility. I think we've passed the point where that works. And that's what concerns me about even some people who are considered on this notion of civility, it just won't save us. That's how I feel. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, so today I'll be talking about my paper, Solidarity, Not Surrender, Queer Anti-Fascism and the Rise of the European Far Right. Queer activists have played a leading role in the current revival of anti-fascism, as seen at the 2017 Charlottesville and Berkeley rallies. Yet the history of queer anti-fascist resistance remains underexplored. This in spite of the fact that queer anti-fascists have consistently organized on their own and within larger coalitional groups, such as Anti-Fascist Action in Britain, Ireland, and Germany. Intersectional and transnational approaches are needed, which examine the interconnections of sexuality, gender, race, and class in anti-fascist organizing. My research does this by looking at gay liberationists in 1970s Western Europe who engaged in and formulated a queer anti-fascism. By this, they meant a robust anti-fascist activism rooted in queerness and an analysis of an everyday fascism imminent to capitalist society. Rather than frame fascism as merely a form of totalitarianism or a marginal and fringe movement, these queer activists connected fascism to existing oppressive structures such as patriarchy, racism, and compulsory heterosexuality. For these activists, queerness was necessarily anti-fascist and intersectional. In my larger dissertation project, I show how this was a conscious challenge to dominant medical, popular, and activist discourses which constructed fascism as queer, going back to Stalinist interpretations of homosexuality as bourgeois decadence and fascist perversion, and William Reich's groundbreaking work on the politics of sexuality in the 1930s. In my talk today, I focus on the 1970s, when radical gay liberation movements emerged, critiquing structural inequalities and oppression while calling for the creation of radical queer subjectivities. As is well known, New York queer and transgender activists of color, such as Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera, founded the first gay liberation front in the wake of the Stonewall Uprising in June 1969. The founders of the first European gay liberation movement, Aubrey Walters, a trans woman and member of the Communist Party of Great Britain, and Bob Millers, a gay socialist activist, met in New York City protesting outside the Women's House of Correction with the founders of the New York City GLF against the imprisonment of Black Panther Party members Angela Davis and Joan Bird. Both Walters and Millers were living in the U.S. at the time and active in the Black Power, women's liberation, and queer movements. While New York City is often given a deserved pride of place, my research also focuses on Philadelphia, and especially the Revolutionary People's Constitutional Convention, organized by the Black Panther Party in September 1970, as a key origin site. As Ronald Porter and others have written, the convention sought to build a coalition of marginalized groups. Gay liberation and women's liberation activists were invited and played a key, though not uncontested, role. And I should say Aubrey Walters and Bob Millers were both at this convention. And 3 weeks after coming back from this convention, founded the London Gay Liberation Front, and drawing on this influence. So drawing on these influences from Black Power, women's liberation, and Marxism, queer anti-fascists emerged out of the gay liberation fronts in Europe to counter the rise of the post-war far right, as seen with the Italian social movement in Italy, the National Front in Britain, the Front National in France, the renewed oppression under Franco in Spain, and the National Democratic Party of Germany. These activists made unique contributions to anti-fascist theory and praxis. While the larger anti-fascist movement of the late 1970s organized against formal fascist parties, I argue that queer anti-fascists organized earlier, in the early 1970s, adopted novel tactics, privileging direct action and substantive community work, and utilized an intersectional approach centering queerphobia as a constitutive aspect of fascist ideology and conceptions of self, race, and nation. Rooting their activism in their lived experience as an oppressed community, these activists confronted fascism in structural terms by organizing against white supremacy, patriarchy, and capitalism in everyday life, while also standing against explicit fascist parties. From 1970, queer anti-fascists were already organizing within groups such as the Front Homosexuel d'Action Révolutionnaire in France and the Gay Liberation Front in the UK, which viewed itself explicitly as part of the wider movement aiming to abolish all forms of oppression under capitalism. And that's from the founding document of the London Gay Liberation Front. While the GLF emphasized the need for organizational independence, it framed its activism as a militant socialist struggle in coalitional alliance with feminists, anti-racist, and anti-colonial revolutionaries in Vietnam, Ireland, and around the globe. My work also centers lesbians, such as Mary McIntosh, transgender activists, such as Aubrey Walters, and non-binary people, such as Mario Mieli in Italy, who led the way in pushing for more revolutionary theory and praxis. My project also adopts a transnational approach for 3 reasons. 1, queer anti-fascists organized across nation-state boundaries 2, they rejected existing state formations for reproducing oppressive structures. And 3, the underlying premise of their politicization of identity was queerness as a class formed by a shared experience of oppression under capitalism rather than one defined in relation to any particular nation, state, or region. Even after the demise of the first gay liberation groups, queer anti-fascist activism continued to grow while maintaining this intersectional vision, as seen in the UK with Gays Against Nazis, and in Italy with Fiori and Miele's Gay Communism. And that's from a book he wrote. In doing so, queer anti-fascists did not reject the use of violent self-defense, but they did challenge prevailing activist notions and instead sought to combat fascist violence with both direct action and community work in, for example, building community centers and providing local resources to working class communities. In addition to against the grain archival research and private collections, oral histories are essential to my project. In 2018, I was able to interview a lesbian feminist activist who called for punks and queer people in the 1970s to join the anti-fascist struggle in British lesbian, feminist, punk, and anti-fascist zines. Her accounts of well-known anti-fascist moments, such as the battles of Wood Green and Lewisham, are vital for queering anti-fascist history. I was also able to interview a major feminist musician who, as a black woman active in the punk, ska, and anti-fascist scenes, was highly aware of the threat of fascism and its connections to racism and other social structures. Her account allows for an exploration of the little explored cultural components of anti-fascist activism as well. Discos, zines, punk shows, installations, street theater, and ska gigs were all vital as binds for a queer activist community and as effective fundraising sources. I also use these interviews to show how anti-fascism changed in the 1980s, increasingly on the local level. As European governments shifted to the right, taking the wind out of fascist parties' sails, the larger anti-fascist movement went into a period of relative decline and restructuring before the emergence of new forms of autonomous organizing later in the decade. Meanwhile, many of these organizations, such as the Socialist Workers' Party in the UK, had maintained the traditional denunciations of homosexuals as, at best, bourgeois distractions from the real goal of class revolution. This led to burnout and fatigue for queer activists, many of whom left these organizations in disgust, and the demise of many groups due to lack of support and resources. Unable to work with the socialist left, many had to choose between continuing on their own or joining new reformist groups, which began making substantial headway in the 1980s, pursuing a strategy of gay rights over queer socialism. I would also argue, though, that this was a restructuring rather than an endpoint. Many continued the radical activism with an increased focus on the state. Some worked on the local level, founding community centers. Others continued the tactics of gay liberation, such as radical AIDS activists, such as Peter Tatchell, who was one of the most prominent AIDS activists of the 1990s, as well as a member of Anti-Fascist Action in the 1980s and the Gay Liberation Front in the 1970s. Kind of a nice through line there. And increasingly, activists of color founded their own organizations in response to a neglect on the part of earlier organizations to specifically address issues of police brutality, housing, education, and inequality. Research on the far right and anti-fascism is particularly needed in these times. The rise of the global far right is one of the most serious and concerning political trends of the current moment. Queer anti-fascists foreshadowed and laid the ground for the current anti-fascist moment by emphasizing a radical intersectionality and coalitional approach. In doing so, they opened up possibilities for new and radical queer subjectivities by arguing that queerness was anti-fascist by its very nature. They also provided an analysis which helps us in our own times to understand fascism and its roots in our structurally racist, sexist, and capitalist society. Too often today, we see reporting which individualizes or marginalizes far-right and neo-Nazi movements. This is particularly egregious when it comes to shootings and terror attacks perpetuated by avowed neo-Nazis and white supremacists, whom the media often depicts as radicalized lone wolves alienated from society. Or, and to kind of get back to Professor Harold's comments, to use an example closer to us of how many in the media chose to report on the Unite the Right rally while neglecting the larger context of police brutality, voter disenfranchisement, segregation, and inequality in Charlottesville, and the history of UVA as a bastion for eugenics and white supremacist thought. As such, I'm inspired by Professor Harold and Kathleen Ballou and others who show the long histories and social contexts lying behind movements we would often like to think of as merely marginal. Rather than fringe, structural analyses show how fascism is connected to the very oppressive structures that exist today. Thanks.
First, I want to thank the PVI for giving me the opportunity to be a fellow this year and for supporting this project, and in particular Denise and Nick on a personal note for starting the PVI and for being both inspirations and advisors for my dissertation. The paper I gave to our discussant represents the beginnings of the theory that I'm building on for my broader dissertation. And what I'll be presenting today are some of the highlights of that theory, and I'll do the best that I can to convey it in a short 10 minutes, but of course I welcome any of your clarifying questions or calls to expound in the discussion section. So, the big question driving my project is, why is the radical right so appealing to some people and not others? And of course, literature on the radical right and this question isn't necessarily new. In the aftermath of World War II, a wealth of scholarship arose to try to explain, how did we get Nazism? Why did people support it? How did Nazism lead to genocide? And it evolved from there to end up really focusing on the rise of radical right parties in Western Europe. So there was a very, at least in the political science literature, a very geographic and institutional focus, at least in the beginning. But of course, institutional explanations only go so far to try to answer this question, partly because institutions are relatively static and don't change drastically, whereas we've seen ebbs and flows of the radical right and the far right quite drastically back and forth since the end of World War II. And so, of course, there's also a pretty large behavioral literature that's attempted to say, well, okay, who is the average person that supports the radical right? And we kind of end up with this little checkbox type approach that says insert man, insert lower economic status, insert rural, insert anti-immigrant, and you get this little person and they're like, oh, this is the average radical right supporter. But of course we know that there's a lot more variation. Women do vote for the far right. Minorities support the far right. And so we have this account of the average person that doesn't capture the full scope. And then lastly, we have, of course, there are various attitudes that people have that tend to be predictors, whether or not someone is anti-immigrant. If you live in Europe, whether you're Eurosceptic or, skeptic of the European Union. And, those expand our focus, expand the bin and capture more people, but again, they don't go all the way. And in particular, we don't have a full understanding of the psychological processes, in the brain that might make certain people more likely to support it or not. So we have demographics, we have attitudes that we can, measure and observe, and we have these institutions, but still we're kind of left asking, well, we see all this variation across time and space, what is doing the work? And so I'm saying, what can gender tell us about the appeal of the radical right? And of course, I'm not necessarily just saying, what do assigned male and assigned female bodies do that makes them more likely to support the radical right? I want to push beyond just the gender gap, of which there exists a gender gap in voting. Men are more likely to vote and support, at least on paper, the radical right. I want us to think about gender as a site of power, gender as, as it's referred to in the literature, both a category and a process. And gender as a literal psychological process that makes certain people more likely to respond to radical right messaging. When we're born, from the day we're born, even in utero, there's this gendering that we are exposed to. And all of us, pretty much wherever we grow up across the world, end up acquiring, a gendered lens through which we process the world around us. We assign things as masculine or feminine, certain behaviors, certain structures, certain attitudes. And I'm arguing that that has real implications for a movement that traffics in a very gendered rhetoric and a gendered way of being, much of it implicit, but also a lot of it very explicit as well. So ultimately, it's succeeding at pushing concerns over immigration and other core far-right issues to the forefront of national conversations using what I'm arguing are these nostalgic gendered frames that are both explicit and implicit. And what I'm showing here in this photo is maybe the most extreme, dramatic version of this I could possibly come up with. Usually we're not so lucky to see something represented quite like this, but what we have here is this Polish magazine that is connected to the Radical Right Party, Law and Justice Party in Poland. It says the Islamic rape of Europe, and the subtitle is, what the elites in Brussels and the media aren't telling European Union citizens. And there's obviously a lot of implicit and explicit imagery going on here. You have this woman who is draped in the European Union flag being grabbed by these brown hands. And there's obviously racial, Islamophobic, and gendered imagery here. But I want us to think critically about what exactly is the bigger message that's behind this. Obviously, it's, even though she's in the European Union flag, they're saying, what are the elites in Brussels not telling us? They're separating, there's that populist rhetoric, so they're not necessarily worried about the dissolution of the European Union here. They're worried about the loss of the idea of Europe. And they're representing Europe as a woman. And if you listen to their message inside the magazine, the message is, this party, the far-right party, is the only thing that's going to save us, right? And that savior and protectionist language is very masculine, right? And the idea of the European Union citizen that needs protection, or the Polish citizen, if we're taking it down to the sub-European Union level, as needing protection, is something that I think is very important in the bigger argument that I'm making here. So gender then is being used to prime how people view immigrants and other key radical right policy platforms in a way that may align with their pre-existing gender biases. So my overarching hypothesis then is that people who end up seeing the world through a very gender traditional lens are going to be the most likely to find the radical right appealing, due to a congruence between a radical right ideology that is very rooted in gender traditionalism and that type of rhetoric, and people who see and process the world in a way that is more gender traditional. So people who are gender traditional and they have related anxieties about their changing surroundings are going to be more responsive to this framing, because it's basically a one-to-one match. If there's this, if you can think of it as a puzzle piece in these individuals' minds, there's this gender traditional rhetoric right there. They have a gender traditional puzzle piece in their minds, and it's going to go like this, and it's going to interlock. So, overall, I'm arguing that the ideology taps into this psychological process that is, for many people, below the level, and for most people, below the level of consciousness, the gendering of their entire surroundings. And that is both comforting and familiar to people who support it. If you feel good that someone's saying, we're going to take you back the way it was, and we're going to talk about it in a way that you're used to processing the world with. You are comforted by the idea of someone protecting you. You're comforted by the idea of order kind of being restored. Yeah, that's going to make you more likely to support it. So my aim is to test this hypothesis, and of course there are various sub-hypotheses that come out of it, through surveys and survey experiments in 4 countries, as well as through a secondary data analysis on 30 countries using the European Value Survey, so connecting gender attitudes to support for the far right. And this picture here, an acquaintance of mine was visiting, I think it was Austria, and there's this called Generation Europe movement over there who sticks these stickers and waves these little flags all over, and this is quite typical of the type of messaging you will see from the far right, both the activists and the elite. So it says make love and defend Europe. Obviously pronatalism is a big part of it. If we have more white European babies, we'll be able to wash out these new immigrants. We'll preserve our nation. Our nation will not be muddied. And so I thought that was a really, another really good visual representation of this type of gendered and, of course, pro-heterosexual type of rhetoric that the radical right is pushing. So, in the interest of time, I'll stop there, but I'm really looking forward to your comments, and thank you for the opportunity.
So thank you very much, Charles and Olyvia. I will first try to summarize actually